Welcome to the channel of International. International is a magazine, and I'm Heinz Gärtner. I'm a member of the editorial board of the magazine, and today is March 6, 2024. Today's topic is the Iran elections and the aftermath. And we do have an excellent expert to talk about this issue, about the elections and more. We have here Professor Shireen Hunter from Washington. She was heading several think tanks in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels, and she was a professor at Georgetown University, and now she is honorary professor at the Alwaleed Centre for Muslim and Christian Understanding of Georgetown University, and she is also a former diplomat. So I'm sorry that I cannot mention all your steps in your career, but these are just to give some introduction. And of course, she wrote extensively about the Caucasus, about Iran and the region. Iran elections, of course, we know the results more or less. So the conservatives and maybe some would say also hardliners won the parliamentary elections. At the same time, there were elections for the Council of Experts, which is an institution consisting of 88 religious persons elected for 8 years. But now the voter turnout was, as expected, very low, even lower than in the 2020 elections. So it's not entirely clear what the percentage is, but it is 40% or less. And in Tehran, what was even much lesser. So what we have here as a result now, that the conservatives, hardliners some would say, dominate all the branches of the government. So that is the government, of course, with President Raisi. This is the parliament now, and this is also the judiciary, which is traditionally very conservative. So my question, Shireen, my first question is, do elections matter at all? Even if you compare it maybe to the Shah regime, or do we have now, second part of the question, it's just more of the same, what we had the last 4 years. Shireen.
Thank you. Thank you, Heinz. It's very disappointing, I think, the whole election process and how it has evolved in the last, decade or so. Before, I think that elections did matter. Several times, like, for example, in 1997, when President Khatami won the elections rather resoundingly, and the rate of participation was quite high. The same way was with Hassan Rouhani, who won the elections. And there were some real changes that happened both under Khatami and under Rouhani. But the problem with the Iranian system is that Iranian system is a hybrid system. And in my opinion anyway, they have tried to combine two irreconcilable concepts. What are these two irreconcilable concepts? One of them is government basically by God or God's representatives, which is the Islamic dimension. And then they have also tried to create a sort of a mechanism for ensuring that the regime has popular support, and hence the republic, the Islamic Republic. But as I have written in the past, these two cannot be reconciled. And I think that what we have seen happen is that increasingly the Republican dimension of the regime has been undermined, and increasingly the religious aspect of the government has become strengthened, and that means that basically the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and people that who are close to him essentially control the government, and this has led to a high degree of, I think, popular disenchantment in the parliamentary process, and they have displayed this disappointment and the lack of trust that any change could come through the parliamentary process by not participating in the elections. And the latest elections, actually, I think that the rate of participation was the lowest since the establishment of the Islamic Republic. But it seems to me that the regime has to make up its mind. Either it will just say, okay, people don't matter, God's law rules, and the supreme leader is the interpreter of the law, and so do away with this kind of pretense of parliamentarism, or open up somewhat, and so that in future elections, for example, there would be in a year or so again presidential elections, that actually people have a real choice, and if they feel that they have a real choice, then they will participate. But at the moment, I think that the whole Republican aspect of the regime of Islamic Republic has become extremely weak.
Yeah, you're saying that the Republican aspect has become really weak. Nevertheless, we do have some remnants of the Republican system. And of course, Iran was one of the first countries in the world trying this parliamentary system in 1906, which failed. But my assumption is it never entirely disappeared. And still, we do have a very complex, complicated political system in Iran, which seems there's a possibility of checks and balances. Of course, there's the supreme leader who takes the final decisions, but you have the government, and you have the parliament, you have the National Security Council, you have the Council of Experts, you have the Guardian Council, you have the army, you have the Revolutionary Guards, and several police forces. It seems there has to be some, even so the reformist has been sidelined, and you're saying the system has been, the Republican system has been undermined. Nevertheless, we do still have factions in Iran, moderates, conservatives, hardliners, and there is some sort of checks and balances which might distinguish a system from a monarchy, let's put it that way. And it maybe in the kernel, it has the possibility for reform, or not at all.
Well, I think that my own feeling has been for a very, very long time that this Iranian regime really has two options. And one of them was tried, I think, the most seriously by Khatami, which means that basically through reform, gradual reform. And I personally prefer gradual reform rather than another revolutionary upheaval or the total collapse of the political power, because I think that would be disastrous for Iran, and I don't think that it would benefit the region and the world either. But the important thing is that the system has to undergo fundamental change. And this change could come either through reform and through a new interpretation of Islam and so on. And that is what was done during the Khatami regime. They were the so-called new thinkers in Islam, and I studied that in my book, Reformist Voices of Islam. But the problem is that, as you know better than I do, ideology is connected to power. And so what this means is that the changes in ideology will also result in changes in who occupies the centers of power. And I think that this is where really what we see, all this factionalism and all that, there is a bit of an ideological dimension to it. There are the Islamist purists that just the same time that the elections was going on, there was a controversy over the canceling of the concert of a rather popular Iranian singer because there were women playing musical instruments in his orchestra. So you see, there are some purists that they want a very narrow interpretation of Islam. There still are. But my own observation is really all this factionalism and so on is about gaining power. And unfortunately, in the context of Iran, when you have power, you also benefit economically. Corruption, unfortunately, is rampant in Iran. And this, I think, applies to both reformists and conservatives or hardliners. But the fact is, my own belief is that you either accept democracy, of course, maybe with certain caveats in countries like Iran, which are vulnerable to external manipulation, or you don't. And if you accept democracy, then you also have to accept the results, the people's decisions. And if you don't, then democracy becomes meaningless, and even in advanced democratic countries like United States. So I think in Iran, a lot of the major problem really is in the nature of the regime. You cannot combine rule of God with the rule of the people. Democracy is a secular concept. It's essentially based on the people's will, decision. But in the Islamic Republic, they say that it is the rule of Islam, the Islamic principle that must rule, and who interprets those rules are the supreme leader. And so to me, there is a major systemic problem in Iran. I'm not saying that this cannot be overcome. It can. And if you have a supreme leader that has democratic tendencies and is willing to pronounce, decisions and interpretations of Islam that are more compatible with democratic rules, this can happen. This can happen through reform without going to some sort of a political upheaval or convulsion. But as long as this dichotomy is not resolved, I think we are going to see this kind of pendulum swinging from one side to another without any real results. So that is one problem.
Yeah, we saw some attempts, of course, in the past for change, coming also from the population. And we saw it, of course, in fall 2022, when we had these demonstrations all over Iran. And all of a sudden, the world saw these well-educated women. So they could use the system somehow to get educated. And to raise their voice. They're not only these invisible suppressed women here. We do have in Iran, of course, we saw it. And they also voiced their protest and going to the street. Not all of them went to the street, but many of them did. And these women, they don't disappear. The demonstrations somehow abated, of course, but the women are still there, and the requests are still there. They are not fulfilled. So, what do you see? Do these women now have? What room of maneuver can they use now in order to bring some change for themselves and for the society altogether?
Well, I think that certainly the women's grievances is a big part of the whole social and political landscape in Iran. And again, here there is a paradox within the Islamic regime. The Islamic regime claims that it has educated more women than in the previous thing. That is, of course, true. But if there had not been a revolution, even more women would have been educated. But the thing that they don't realize, exactly, but what they don't realize is that when you educate a woman, you cannot expect that woman to behave like is a woman that hasn't, been to school or doesn't know anything, has no awareness of her own person and her own rights, both within family and in society. And so they are. The regime is unwilling to recognize that. And it's not just regarding women, regarding the younger people. One of the problems of the regime is now the rate of immigration. It's just basically they are spending all this money on educating youngsters, male and female, and they are leaving. I read a comment that one politician had made. He said that any medical doctor in Iran, as soon as they get their degree, they apply for some embassy or other for immigrant visa. And so these are all going, you cannot educate the whole population and then expect them to just say whatever the leader says, we are going to listen to that, and we have no say in how our own country is run. And so again, you see the whole, as I mentioned, the whole system is really a paradoxical an effort, as I mentioned earlier, to try to combine two irreconcilable concepts, rule by the law of God and democratic rule. Now, it's just that I don't mean democracy the way we understand in the Western world necessarily, but, I think Turkey, for example, has managed in some ways, even Erdogan, who started out as a fiery Islamist, has realized that he cannot do that. So it has given the woman a degree of freedom. If you are a Muslim woman and you want to wear the hijab, okay, fine, go ahead. And in fact, they help them. They give more advantages to the women who wear the hijab. But they don't go trying to force the secular woman and others also to wear the hijab. Iranian regime has not come to this conclusion. For some reason, the whole woman issue has become a symbol for them. They feel that if they give in on some of the woman's demands, including, for example, the freedom to choose to wear or not to wear the Islamic hijab, then, the whole system will collapse. But they have to understand that. And there are elements in Islam that will allow them to do that. There is a prophet saying that no compulsion in faith. In other words, you cannot force anybody to accept religious, dictum and all that. And if you had a proper supreme leader, he would certainly do that, and with fatwa. Already a lot of the clerics, when the demonstrations were going on 2 years ago in Iran, a number of clerics were saying that there's nothing in Islam that mandates compulsory hijab. And I think that they have some valid reasons to argue that. So I am not suggesting that the road of reform is closed, but the problem is that the personal ambitions of powerful people is, preventing it. I don't know whether this is correct or not, but more important than the parliamentary elections were elections for the what it called the Council of Experts, which will elect the future supreme leader. Now, one of the most amazing things was that Hassan Rouhani was disqualified. Hassan Rouhani, who was president for 8 years, and before that held all kinds of offices and so on, suddenly disqualified. So what does this mean? It is a pure and simple act to try to create a council that would elect the people that they have in mind who should be. I mean, I would certainly say if we had a supreme leader like Khomeini's grandson, who is very liberal, a lot of reforms could have happened, including the abolishing of compulsory hijab. But the problem is the personal ambitions of different personalities and different factions.
Yeah, let's move on to foreign policy questions. This lack of democracy, which somehow the perception in the West is somehow distorted, of course, because of this complexity in the political system. But anyway, the perception in the West and in the US and Europe is that that Iran is basically one-man dictatorship, and that's why Iran is considered to be a rogue state, because that was, and Iran is put in the same basket as China and Russia. Of course, Iran is a powerful state in the region, but of course it doesn't have this global power as the other states have. So why is the US so obsessed with Iran?
Well, I think that to begin with, Iran is not a powerful state. To be honest, I would say when we say a country is powerful, we have to have some standards of measuring this power. Where it is the economic power, its military power, and on every sort of standard, Iran is not a powerful country. I mean, in many ways, UAE, even though it's a tiny country and so on, is much more powerful than Iran. So I think this is one of the things that is, it's just that what I call it, Iran is a convenient enemy. Now, of course, again, relations with Russia became strained, and then the rise of China, there are some other enemies that have emerged. But both of these enemies are far more powerful. They cannot be treated as Iran is treated. I mean, the US found out you cannot treat China. You can't just dictate to China, do this or not do this, or because China is a real power and can cause real problem. Even Russia, I mean, with the war in Ukraine, we have seen that Russia has a lot more resources that was given. So I think that they cannot really treat real powers the way they treat Iran. Iran is a weak country with a very, I think, inept leadership that either doesn't know the dynamics of power and the role of power in international relations, or they know it, but for some reason or another, they have decided to ignore it. But why the US has put Iran in this situation? One of them, as I mentioned, is that Iran is a convenient enemy. The US has used Iran, so-called Iranian threat to keep the Persian Gulf Arab states within its sphere of influence. And so, as I said, it's a convenient enemy, selling all these arms and so on and Europe to some European countries, of course, not your country, different, but have done the same thing, the UK, Germany, and Britain, and so on. So this is one element of it. The other thing is that, frankly, the Iranians have, to some extent, brought this upon themselves. I mean, if you make the so-called struggle with imperialism, which in the Islamic Republic's definition, it only applies to the American imperialism. Chinese imperialism or Russian imperialism or some other imperialism, they don't seem to understand. They have a very narrow definition of imperialism. So this obviously affects the opinions, affects the the sentiments in the Congress, but another most important thing, frankly, I think it's the Israeli influence. And I cannot 100% blame the Israelis. I mean, Iran also chose to basically make an enemy of Israel. This need not have happened. And so it comes to the fact that the elements in Iran that have still stuck in the sort of the late 60s and early 70s ideological mindset of the Arab extremists, radicals, what I call unholy trinity, which was a sort of a reward version of Lenin's thing. They call what they call it imperialism, international Zionism, and Arab reaction. They are still in that mindset, and this has been extremely destructive for Iran. And any effort to change that, as we have seen, has become almost impossible. So I think it's really shows the fact that, as I have so many times argued in writing and otherwise, Iran does not have a national policy. In other words, Iranians don't put their own national interest. The Iranian government does not put its own national interests foremost, because Iran's national interests would argue that they should have balanced relations both with Israel and with Arabs. I mean, Iran's anti-Israel posture has not endeared them to the Arabs. That's a fact. I mean, and Iran has been used both by Israelis and by Arabs in their own foreign policy objectives. It again comes to the very fact of the nature of the Islamic Republic and what they, prioritize. And of course, the hardliners are more in that line than the not all of the reformists, because some of the reformists are also anti-national because they come from a background of the left and the former Tudeh party and other leftist governments. So I have reservations about some reformists as well. It's not like all reformists are good. And hardliners, or conservatives, I shouldn't say hardliners, are also divided among themselves. They are more rational conservatives, but Iran is very fractured at so many levels, and it seems to me there is no mechanism to resolve these differences, and unfortunately, American policies has not helped. The U.S. policy and Europe following U.S. Contributed to the hardliners getting the upper hand, because every time the reformists made overtures to the Americans and others, they were shut down. I mean, I do believe if, for example, when President Biden became president in 2021, assumed the presidency in 2021, if he had returned to the JCPOA and lifted at least some of the sanctions, Rouhani would have been reelected. Or not Rouhani, but a reformist would have been reelected. And now, of course, the Russians now have very, very extensive control over Iran. And they are also, really haven't done anything for Iran, but have prevented it. They are not themselves admitting. Amir Abdullahian, the foreign minister, admitted that Russia prevented the resurrection of the JCPOA. And of course, after the Ukraine war, this whole thing became sort of connected to one another.
The GCPA would be another topic we should talk about, but maybe still to the regional developments. Of course, the perception of Iran in the region is that to some extent it's a dangerous power. And that's why we had also this normalization process when when the Arab states and Israel tried to get some alliance against Iran to some extent. This normalization at Abraham Accords was a sort of balance of power in order to have some alliance against the most powerful, what they considered the most powerful state in the region. And also Iran is blamed to support all these proxies to extend its powers. So starting with Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, and also Hezbollah. And of course, Israel thinks Iran might want to start a regional war. However, when we hear from Iranian officials, they would say they have nothing to do with that, what the proxies do. They support them, they send them weapons, but they don't want to be drawn into a broader regional conflagration. So I don't know how far this is true, but we have these two tendencies. Is Iran, on the one hand, extending its power with the proxies? On the other hand, it is trying to hold them back, not to start a regional power where Iran might be involved. And if Iran might be involved, Israel even more, and Israel might also want to have some support by the United Nations, by the United States. And so that, of course, will be an escalation in the region. So what do you see? Is Iran expanding or holding back its allies? Let's put it that way. The axis of resistance, how they call it.
That's right. Well, I think that there are two different issues that we have to talk about. One of the major things is that basically Iran is in a region that is surrounded by his historic enemies, which predate the modern era and predates even the Islamic Republic. It was the same way during the Shah. Arabs didn't, and Israel, of course, at that time didn't have the kind of power and influence that it has now. So it had to make deals with Iran to some extent. But Arabs will dislike Iran no matter what. This is a fact. I know this is what I have also told the Iranians, but they don't, in my writing, not in direct speaking. There are certain historic things. Unfortunately, Iran has not gone through the process that Europe went through after the Second World War, and that a lot of the, old ethnic and other enmities became resolved and subsumed, although I believe that unfortunately Eastern Europe is remnants of that is still there, and we see that the Russians and the Poles and Serbs and others and so on. But this is a fact, and even Turkey. So Iran is surrounded by Turks and by Arabs, who are the historic enemies of the ancient Iranian people. this is one element. The other thing is the element of power. The Persian Gulf Arab states did not like the Shah either. They don't want Iran to play a role in that. For example, calling the Persian Gulf the Arabian Gulf. Who is expansionist? I think the country who wants to change the name of a body of water. I mean, so I think that these are one of the two things that I would put in that Israel even, contributed to the fall of the Shah because Israel was unhappy that the Shah was not listening completely to everything they wanted to do. They were angry when Iran signed the Algiers agreement with Saddam Hussein because they thought that then Saddam might, turn its attention to the Western Front. So I think there are all these kind of historical ethnic animosities, and more important than those, the power dynamics. Egypt doesn't want Iran to be active in the Persian Gulf because they want to be active themselves. It goes to Nasser and so on. I've written this in my book on Arab-Iranian relations. So I think that there are some of these elements. The other thing is that in many ways, Israel is paying, and the Saudis are paying the price of the actions that they have done, and also the Americans. For example, the Hezbollah was established in Lebanon after the Israelis invaded in 1982. And Iran was not first involved in that. And so there are local and regional factors beyond Iran. And the Palestinian problem, for example, Iran did not create the Palestinian problem. But what I would say is that the current regime in Iran has tried to manipulate this problems and somehow to, for example, the Iranians would like to have a pathway to the Mediterranean. I think that rather than being enamored of Bashar Assad, relations with Syria is, to get some access through that, or in Iraq, the same way. Iran is blocked in many ways. They can't, whichever they move, somebody is unhappy with them. So I think that everything Iran does, they say that it's because of expansionism and imperialism. But I mean, what does UAE have to do in Sudan, for example? But nobody questions what are they doing in Sudan, in Djibouti, or in other places. So there is one element of that. And then, for example, in Yemen, I don't think that the Iranians even knew who the Houthis are until the Saudis invaded, Yemen. So yes, Iran has what I would call has used these opportunities created by the mishandling of things. In Iraq, for example, if U.S. had not invaded Iraq in 2003, none of these things that would have happened. So I think that, as I said, Iran it's both Iran and the Americans and Israelis, they just want to blame all of their problem on the other side without assuming responsibility for their own actions. I mean, all of Iran's problems is not because of sanctions or other things. Of course, they are very important. But I think it's basically a lack of willingness to accept responsibility for one's own actions. And so in your answer, to sum it up, I say that I don't think that Iran has caused these issues. In fact, even the Americans admitted that Iran didn't know that Hamas is planning an attack. And Hamas's relations with Iran has never been very close. Iran has been closer to the small groups like the Islamic Jihad and so on, which are really of no consequence. Most of the money for Hamas has come from Qatar. I remember in 2006, after Hamas won the elections, the first place that Khalid Mash'al went was to Saudi Arabia. The Palestinians have their own aspirations, and so they will go to help wherever they can get it. But I don't think that Iranians want right now any kind of escalation of the conflict, because they will be the ones that will suffer more. And even, I don't know whether this is correct, but even in the American media, they were reported that Iran has been discouraging some of the militia in Iraq and Syria to attack Americans. And so they have tried to sort of calm it down.
Do you see any opportunity in this deal, what we have between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that it goes further, because that might be a possibility for another sort of normalization in the region?
Well, I don't think that this is what if I might use a metaphor from the military thing, what we have between Saudi Arabia and Iran is not peace, it's a sort of a ceasefire. And so it is a little bit limited. I think partly is that Saudis realize that, for their ambitions and what they want to do, it would be better if they could have some sort of a modus vivendi to Iran. But I personally believe that it's a very fragile reconciliation. I remember it from my times when I was at the Foreign Service. The Saudis are very anti-Iran. It's in at least the ruling class. It's almost in their DNA. It's for sectarian reasons and other things. But I think that, and also I think that maybe the Saudis realize the limits of normalization with Israel. And as the Saudis become more powerful, they are not going to be willing to play second fiddle to the Israelis. This is where I'm saying the power dynamics. So the Saudis also would like to keep their options open and balance Iran and Israel against one another, and how shall I say, maximize their own influence and power. I wish the Iranians could play the power politics a bit more. I don't mean power politics in a cynical fashion, but mostly I mean a reasonable approach to power and the realization that stability basically comes, in my humble opinion, from a balance of power. And any time that there is a massive change in the balance of power in favor of one side or another, is destabilizing. And so I think it's a positive thing, the Saudi-Iranian reconciliation, but the expectations of each side is so different. Iranians had hopes that Saudis will invest in Iran economically and so on. I would call these things pipe dreams. I mean, no country will do that. It's so.
That was a very realist picture at the end.
Well, it is, unfortunately, the world is the way it is. You see, the realists, one of the things is that the realists, I think, make their theory based on the observations of the outside world. Some of the other schools try to impose their own framework on the world, and it doesn't work. I think that we have seen this in the last 30 years.
Well, thank you. That was a very analytical, sober, but not entirely bleak picture. So there are still some rooms for opportunities, what concerns the Iranian society, also what concerns foreign policy. So fascinating, Shireen. Thank you so much. If you allow, we come back to you at some point in the next couple of months again. That was very important for our channel. I want to thank also our viewers. And again, Shireen, for your time you gave us. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
My pleasure, Heinz, always. Thank you.